The monitors had been screaming for 4 minutes when Marcus Bell decided he wasn't leaving. Nobody had invited him into that room. Nobody wanted him there, not the 2 nurses fighting to keep a 9-year-old boy's heart beating, not the security guard who'd been chasing him out of the hospital lobby for the better part of an hour, and certainly not the boy's father, a man whose name was on the building's east wing, who stood frozen against the wall with the particular helplessness of someone who had never once in his adult life been unable to fix a problem with money. Marcus was 11 years old, and he had walked into St. Vincent's that morning because it was cold. Outside in the lobby, had good heat and nobody usually noticed him if he sat quietly enough near the vending machines. He had a system. He knew which floors had the friendliest security guards, which cafeteria workers would slip him a roll if he asked politely, which waiting rooms had chairs soft enough to sleep in without anyone shaking him awake before dawn. He had been doing this for 8 months, since his mother's apartment became someone else's apartment, and there hadn't been another one waiting for them. Not yet, not soon enough. He hadn't meant to end up in the emergency wing. He'd followed the sound, a commotion, raised voices, the particular controlled chaos of people running toward a crisis instead of away from it, the way curiosity pulls a kid toward anything that isn't boredom. He'd slipped through a door that should have been guarded and wasn't, because everyone's attention had been on the gurney. On it was a boy who looked, for one disorienting second, like he could have been Marcus a few years younger. Same dark hair, same thin wrists, except this boy's lips had gone the color of old bruises, and the machine beside him was making a sound Marcus had heard once before, in a different hospital, on a different terrible day, when they'd told him his mother needed surgery she couldn't afford to survive without. Time of death, a doctor started, stepping back from the boy's chest, exhaustion and defeat written into every line of his shoulders. "No," said the man against the wall, and it came out broken, not commanding, nothing like the voice of a man who ran 3 companies and sat on the boards of 2 hospitals. "No, please, you have to, please!" The room had the particular stillness of people who had done everything correctly and still lost. Marcus knew that stillness. He had felt it in his own chest once. He didn't decide to move. His body simply carried him forward before his mind caught up, past the nurse who reached to grab his shoulder and missed, straight to the boy's side. "Hey," Marcus said, and his voice cracked with the effort of sounding calm. "Hey, come on. Come back. Kid, you can't be in here." A doctor's hand landed on his arm. "He can hear you," Marcus said. Not to the doctor, to the boy, ignoring the hand entirely. He'd read somewhere, in a library he used to sneak into before school, that hearing was the last thing to go. He didn't know if it was true. He needed it to be true. "I know you're scared. I know it feels like everything went quiet all at once, like nobody's coming. But somebody's here. I'm here. Security," someone called from the doorway, and Marcus heard footsteps behind him. Felt a hand close around his shoulder, firm this time, ready to remove him. "Wait," the father's voice, suddenly sharper. "Wait, let him—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't seem to know what he was asking for either. He just knew, in the animal desperation of a parent watching his child slip away, that he wasn't ready to lose anything else in this room, including whatever strange thing was happening in front of him. Marcus kept talking. He didn't know medicine. He didn't know CPR, beyond what he'd half-watched, once on a television in a shelter waiting room. What he knew was what it felt like to be a kid nobody was fighting for, and he refused with every stubborn cell in his underfed body to let this particular kid feel that way for one more second. "My name's Marcus," he said, gripping the boy's small limp hand in both of his own. "What's yours?" "I bet it's something normal like Jack or Sam, and you're gonna open your eyes and tell me I'm wrong, aren't you? Come on, prove me wrong." The lead physician, Dr. Alvarez, though Marcus wouldn't learn her name until later, had stopped moving toward the door. She was watching the monitor instead, watching a line that had gone flat waiver just barely, just once. "Hold on," she said sharply to the room, not to Marcus, resuming compressions with new urgency. "Hold on, everybody, hold on." The line moved again. A shape came back into it, ragged and weak but present. "He's got a rhythm," someone said, disbelieving. "He's got a rhythm. Get the crash cart back over here. Go, go." The next several minutes dissolved into the controlled frenzy of a team fighting to keep a fragile thread from snapping again. Marcus was pulled back from the bed gently this time, by a nurse who didn't seem to have the heart to be rough with him anymore. He stood against the same wall the father had stood against, and for the first time all morning nobody told him to leave. The boy, whose name it turned out was Eli, stabilized enough for surgery 20 minutes later. His father, a real estate developer named Richard Hartwell, whose name Marcus vaguely recognized from a building downtown, sat down hard in a plastic chair in the hallway, once the gurney disappeared through double doors, and put his face in his hands, and didn't move for a long time. Marcus sat 2 chairs away. Nobody had told him to leave yet, and he'd learned a long time ago not to push his luck by asking permission for things people hadn't offered. "Why did you do that?" Richard finally said without looking up. Marcus considered several answers. The honest one felt too big to say out loud, so he said a smaller true thing instead. He looked like he needed somebody in his corner. Everybody in that room had a job to do except me, so I figured mine was to make sure he wasn't alone in it. Richard looked at him properly then, really looked, the way people rarely looked at Marcus anymore, seeing past the too big coat and the shoes with the sole coming loose at the toe. "How old are you?" 11. "Where are your parents?" "My mom's at the shelter on Ferris Street. My dad's not around." Marcus said it plainly, the way you say something you've made peace with out of necessity rather than choice. "I come here sometimes. It's warm. Nobody usually minds." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "You saved my son's life. The doctors saved his life. I just talked to him. Dr. Alvarez said his heart found a rhythm the moment you started talking. She said in 15 years, she's never seen anything like it." Richard's voice wavered. "I don't know what that means medically. I don't think anyone does. But I know what I saw. I saw my son come back because a stranger refused to let him go alone. Eli came out of surgery 4 hours later. Stable cardiologists, cautiously optimistic about a full recovery from what turned out to be a congenital heart defect nobody had caught in time. Richard didn't leave the hospital for 2 days. Neither, as it happened, did Marcus. Richard had quietly arranged a hotel room nearby for Marcus and his mother. No explanation offered beyond that he'd like them close, if that was all right, until he knew how to properly thank them. By the time Eli was well enough for visitors outside his immediate family, he asked for one person specifically. "The boy who talked to me," Eli said, still weak, voice barely above a whisper. "I heard him. I couldn't move, I couldn't open my eyes, but I heard him the whole time. He said somebody was here." Marcus came in wearing a clean shirt Richard had bought him without asking, sat down in the chair beside Eli's bed and said, "Told you I'd be right about your name being something normal." "It's Eli," Eli said and managed a small, exhausted smile. "Not Jack or Sam, you were wrong." "Close enough," Marcus said. What began as a hospital room friendship between 2 boys who had, in wildly different ways, both understood what it felt like to be fighting for something with no guarantee of winning, became something neither family had expected. Richard didn't offer charity. Not exactly, he offered a job. First to Marcus's mother, in his company's facilities department, and an apartment that came with steady work rather than pity. He offered consistency, a school Marcus could stay enrolled in without moving, a standing invitation to visit Eli on weekends, a place at their table that slowly, over months, stopped feeling like a guest seat and started feeling like his own. Eli's recovery took the better part of a year. Marcus was there for most of it, not because anyone required it of him, but because some bonds once forged in the worst 4 minutes of 2 lives don't unravel just because the crisis has passed. He taught Eli card games he'd learned in shelters. Eli taught him things from the private school he attended, patient in a way that mirrored the patience Marcus had shown him on a gurney he shouldn't have been standing beside at all. A year later, at a small dinner Richard hosted to celebrate Eli's full medical clearance, Richard stood and raised a glass, and his voice caught on the first sentence and never quite steadied through the rest of it. "Every doctor in that room did their job," he said. "Every single one of them. I will be grateful to them until the day I die." But there was a moment where the machines had already made their decision, and a boy who had no reason to walk into that room, who had every reason in the world to keep walking past it, chose to stay instead. He looked at Marcus, who was sitting beside Eli, both of them too young to fully understand the weight of the toast being made in their honor. He refused to leave, and because he refused, I still have my son, Marcus, embarrassed by the attention, in the particular way of an 11-year-old boy unused to being celebrated for anything, mostly looked down at his plate. But Eli reached over under the table and squeezed his hand, the same hand that had held his through the worst 4 minutes of his life, and Marcus squeezed back, and neither of them needed the toast to know exactly what had passed between them in that room, and what it had built ever since.